And so, remember David Light said, do you have your Bibles? He said, show me your Bibles. Now, you don't have to, but do get your Bible ready. If you want to see the text I'm referencing tonight, you'll need to look in your own Bible. I'm not going to put it up on the screen. I used to preach this way all the time, but I've gotten so dependent on the PowerPoint, and I need to sometime just break away because you don't always have that everywhere. And I have been asked to speak at a summer series in Cookeville. I think they call it Cookeville Church of Christ, on Judge Not. That's the words, Judge Not. I think they're doing a study on the Sermon on the Mount. Let me read that text to you. Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 5. It says, judge not that ye be not judged. For with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged. And with what measure ye mete, it shall be measured to you again. And while beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Or how wilt thou say to thy brother, let me pull out the mote out of thine eye, and behold, the beam is in thine own eye? Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam out of thine own eye, and then shalt thou see clearly to cast out the mote out of thy brother's eye. Now there's a similar text. I want you to turn to Luke chapter 6, and we're going to look at verses 37 and 38, and then I'm going to skip down to 41 and 42. Luke 6, 37. It's similar. It starts off the same. Judge not. Now here it is. Judge not, and ye shall not be judged. Condemn not, and ye shall not be condemned. Forgive, and ye shall be forgiven. Give, and it shall be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down and shaken together, and running over shall men give into your bosom. For with the same measure that you mete, withal it shall be measured to you again. Down to verse 41. Luke 6:41. And why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but perceiveth not the beam that is in thine own eye? Either how canst thou say to thy brother, brother, let me pull out the mote that is in thine eye, when thou thyself beholdest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Thou hypocrite, cast out first the beam out of thine own eye, then shalt thou see clearly to pull out the mote that is in thy brother's eye. So judge not. Now, the way this sermon usually goes when someone's preaching on this passage is they'll spend a lot of time on how that passage is abused. And I'm going to do that too, but not a lot. I'm going to move the lesson pretty quickly over to what the Lord is teaching. But to hear some folks talk about this, the way some folks throw this verse out at you, you might get the idea that the Lord said don't use good judgment. They say judge not, as though all judging is wrong. In fact, if someone is living in sin, and that's an obvious thing now, I'm not talking about some heart or thought or something that you don't see, but they're doing something that you see, this is wrong, and you'll say, now the Bible says you shouldn't do that. They'll say, don't judge me. Well, what are they doing? Are they not judging you for judging them? I mean, isn't that hypocritical to do that? It's an old problem. You remember Lot down in Sodom, Genesis 19:9. Now, I'm not going to go into the details here in this company, but the men of Sodom wanted to commit a heinous sin, and Lot came up with an alternative, and that itself is going to have to require some explanation that gets beyond this lesson here. But Lot comes up, he says this, he says, do not so wickedly instead, and he offers something else for them. And you know what they said to him? They say, you've come in to sojourn among us, and now you're going to be a judge of us. You know what they're doing? They're throwing it right into his teeth. Judge not. As though judging was the worst sin here. Now, when you're applying God's law to situations, and you say, okay, according to the Bible, that's wrong. You're not judging people. That's God's judgment. God has given us His judgments. And so when we're simply repeating God's judgments, we're not judging people. That's God's judgment. That's the way God has judged people. But people will throw that at you, won't they? Judge not. Now, it's obvious that judge not does not mean no judgment at all. Look at the next verse. Let's go back to Matthew chapter 7. Matthew 7 and verse 6. Here's what it says. Give not that which is holy unto the dogs, neither cast ye your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn again and rend you. How are you going to know if they're dogs or not? I mean, you are to give things holy to people, aren't you? You want to preach the holy word. But here he says, don't give that which is holy to dogs. Well, you're making some kind of judgment here, aren't you? If you're going to withhold that which is holy from those that are acting like dogs. So it doesn't mean no judging. Here's another one. Look down at verse 15. Matthew 7 and verse 15, it says, beware of false prophets. How are you going to do that if you can't judge? You've got to be able to listen to what a prophet says and determine whether it is true or false. And some of these false prophets, now they're not just honestly mistaken, they're deceptive. Look what it says about them. Beware of false prophets. Here's what they do. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. And then verse 16, ye shall know them by their fruits. I like the story they tell about the old preacher Marshall Keeble. A lot of legends about him, but I think this one's one that can be verified, where Marshall Keeble said, I'm not a judge, but I'm a fruit inspector. Okay? So there's a kind of judgment that we're supposed to make. Now, I have this written out in the margin of my Bible. I have written so many things in the margin of my wide margin Bible that this has now become my favorite study Bible, okay? So I've made my own study Bible, but out in the margin, and you may have this in your center column index, I've got this, John 7:24. Judge not, it says. But now here's the way this one goes. Judge not according to appearance, but judge righteous judgment. There's a kind of judging that we should not do. But that verse, John 7:24, said there's a kind of judging we should do. Judge righteous judgment. And so the passage can easily be abused. But let me turn now to some judgments that we should not make. And I don't really have these in any particular order. There's a little bit of order to it that you might not be able to gather, but it's not particularly in order. One of the kind of judgments we should not make is superficial judgments. And that's what John 7 and verse 24 is saying when it says, judge not according to appearance. You know, right at first, sometimes the first impression, the first appearance It may not give you enough information to really make a judgment. And so judge not according to appearance. Appearances can be deceptive. You might see something and think, oh boy, that really looks bad. And then you look further into it and find out, well, I was misreading that. I was misunderstanding what I was saying. I put it in the wrong context or something. Isaiah 11 talks about the coming Christ. And in that regard, I think this is very interesting how it talks about how he's going to judge. Isaiah 11, and let's begin in verse 2, where it says, "And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And he shall make of him quick understanding in the fear of the Lord." Now watch this. "And he shall not judge after the sight of his eyes, neither reprove after the hearing of his ears, but with righteousness shall he judge the poor, and reprove with equity for the meek of the earth, and shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips shall he slay the wicked." When he's going to judge, it's going to be righteous judgment, but not by what he sees and what he hears. He's going to go beyond that and find out what's behind that, and he's going to know what's under that, and his judgment is going to be righteous. Let's go to this one. Here's an example of how we can judge wrongly based on appearance. Go to the book of James. We got an example here. James chapter 2. We're going to begin in verse 1, and you'll recognize the passage when I start reading it. If you judge according to appearance. "My brethren, have not the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory, with respect to persons. For if there come into your assembly a man with a gold ring and goodly apparel, and there come in also a poor man in vile raiment, and ye have respect unto him that weareth the gay clothing, and say unto him, Sit thou here in a good place, and say to the poor, Stand thou there, or sit under my footstool. Are ye not then partial in yourselves, and become judges of evil thoughts?" Appearances can be deceiving, can't they? You might think, boy, this fella, he really looks sharp. He's coming in here all dressed so well and nice. That must be a good fella. And then this other fella come in shabby. What? Something's wrong with him, you know. And yet it might be the exact opposite. You might find out the good fella is the fella that's just coming in kind of dressed rough. I tell you, John the Baptist would have walked in. You might say, "Sit down here at my footstool." You're wearing that old camel's hair, you know. And then those in rich raiment, you might think, boy, they're really good. And you got it wrong. You got it wrong. So superficial judgments is a kind of judgment that we should not make. I can see right now I'm not going to get through this, but that's okay. I'll just give a few of these then. Here's another one. Judging by our own criteria. Now, I've already mentioned that, but let's go back to Matthew chapter 7 and look at verse 2. It says, "Judge not that ye be not judged." Now, here's what happens when you use your own criteria for judging, and we're talking about now judging the righteousness of someone by your own criteria. Here it is. It says, "For with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged, and with what measure ye mete, it shall be measured to you again." You're going to judge someone by your own standards, by your own criteria. Don't be surprised if they don't judge you by their own criteria. See? That's not the way you do it, by our own criteria. John 1 and verse 46. Now this is said by a really good man, Nathaniel. When Jesus saw Nathaniel, and he said this. He said, and Jesus judged rightly. See, he could see all the way into someone's heart. And Jesus said, "Behold, an Israelite in whom is no guile." That's just such a beautiful statement. That means there's no hypocrisy. There's no falsehood. When you knew Nathaniel, You knew just exactly who you knew. He didn't put up a front and try to pretend that he was something better than he was. He was just Nathanael, and you could see it. And so Jesus said, behold, an Israelite in whom there is no guile. But you know what Nathanael had said just before that? Can any good thing come out of Nazareth? I mean, when he found out from Philip that Jesus was of Nazareth, he made a judgment. Can any good thing come out of Nazareth? And so that was his own criteria. He thought Nazareth, that's not a very good place. Don't expect a great prophet out of that. And so it was the wrong criteria to use. But you know, I thought it was interesting. Even the citizens, the inhabitants of Nazareth judged that way about their own selves. Let's look at this. Matthew chapter 13 and verse 53. And here's what we read. It came to pass that when Jesus had finished these parables, he departed thence. And when he was coming to his own country, and that's Nazareth, he taught them in their synagogue, inasmuch as they were astonished and said, whence hath this man this wisdom and these mighty works? And said this, is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary, and his brethren James and Joses and Simon and Judas and his sisters? Are they not with us? Whence then hath this man all these things? And they were offended in him. And Jesus said, a prophet is not without honor, except at save in his own country and in his own house. He did not many works there because of their unbelief. Even in Nazareth, they thought, wait a minute. I know this. He's one of us. He can't be that. We know him. We know his mother. And so he can't be who you think he is. And you know, it'd be easy for us to do. Someone could be very great and very honored. The world sees them, and yet, well, we went to school with them. You know, they're not that much. That's not much. They're just and just almost judge them because they're one of us. And so you can't judge by your own criteria. Now here's one, not to judge, a way not to judge. Judging by our own traditions. Now we got a good example of that in the scriptures. The Sabbath. God told the Jews, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. And there shall no work be done therein. Because in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and he rested on the seventh day. And so you remember that Sabbath, the day of rest. Now the Jews had taken that, they knew what that meant, but then they added their own criteria to it. To where there were certain things, and they had it very spelled out, just certain things you could do and could not do, and it was their traditions. For example, carrying your bed. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 9 and 10, there was a man that was by this pool that was lame, and Jesus came to him and said, arise, take up thy bed and walk. Now it was on the Sabbath day that he did that. And so the man arose, and now he could walk. Now, what is he supposed to do? Just walk off and leave his bed there? No, he took up his bed, and he was carrying it. Now, was he carrying a burden on the Sabbath day? I said, he was not out there doing any work. He wasn't moving from one house to another or trying to get some work done. He had his bed. It would be like a cot. Don't think about a big old bed, you know. He's not carrying a king-size bed around now or a water bed. It's just a little cot that would roll out he rolls it up, and he's carrying that, and he never walked before. And when they saw him, they said, what are you doing carrying your bed on the Sabbath? Well, they cared more about that than the fact that he could walk. And so they applied their tradition. Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. The disciples were hungry, and they were going through a wheat field or a grain field, wheat or barley, and they were plucking the ears off the top. And some of you may have done this. You can pluck those ears when it's dry and kind of rub it in your hands, or get a little grain and and eat it, just like that. You can just eat it right out of the field that way. Now, you weren't supposed to prepare a meal on the Sabbath day. You weren't supposed to go out and harvest your crops and prepare meals on the Sabbath. Now, that's not what the disciples were doing. They were just walking through the field, and it's almost like picking up a cracker and getting a snack or something. And yet they judged them for working on the Sabbath day. It wasn't against the law. It was against their tradition. What about Matthew 12 and verse 10? Now they're watching Jesus. See what he's going to do. It's the Sabbath day. And he's going into the synagogue. And there's a man in there with a withered hand. Is he going to heal on the Sabbath day? And Jesus said, is it wrong to do good on the Sabbath day? And they said it was wrong to help a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath day. That was their tradition. I think it's interesting. Jesus just said, stretch forth thy hand. He didn't go over there and pull his hand out and work it and massage it and make it. He just said, stretch forth the hand. The man stretched it forth and it was whole. Now, what are they going to accuse Jesus of? A miracle? Is that it? They're going to accuse him of a miracle? They couldn't deny the miracle. They couldn't even accuse him without affirming that he did a miracle when he said that. Well, they were judging by their tradition. Here's another one on the Sabbath. Luke 13, 11 through 14, he healed a woman with an infirmity. Here's another one. Luke 14 in verse 3, he healed a man, the Bible calls it dropsy. He had dropsy. Their traditions. In Mark chapter 7, 1 through 5. Let's turn to that one. Mark 7, 1 through 5. Now they had a tradition, and here's their tradition. And then came together unto him the Pharisees and certain of the scribes which came from Jerusalem. And when they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, that is to say, unwashed hands, they found fault. But the Pharisees and all the Jews, except they wash their hands oft, eat not, holding the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the market, except they wash, they eat not, and many other things there be, which they have received to hold, as the washing of cups and pots and brazen vessels and tables. I think some of the translations say couches. That's the places that they would sit. They're just going through here washing everything. Now, the old law didn't say they had to wash everything all the time, but it was their tradition. It goes on and says, and the Pharisees and scribes asked him, why walk not thy disciples according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands? Now, they weren't washing their hands because they were dirty. I mean, that's not what they're doing. In fact, this is kind of interesting. Look at this word in verse 3. Now, I'm reading the King James Version. And here's what it says. Except they wash their hands oft. O-F-T. Oft. The English Revised Version. Now, that's the one that just predated the American Standard Version. Okay, the English Revised Version. And I think the English Standard Version does something just like this. Except they wash their hands in this special way. You know, they may have been washing their hands, but they weren't doing it right. See, you're supposed to go through a ceremony, dip your hands, and then hold them up, you know, and not touch anything. You got to do it a certain way. It's their tradition. And they're judging them by their tradition. Circumcision. Acts chapter 15. In the church, here's why Jesus had to say, judge not that you be not judged. Because there were going to be those in the church that said to the Gentiles, except ye be circumcised after the manner of the law, you cannot be saved. Well, now that's not what Jesus and the apostles taught. But that was their tradition. Here's another one. This will help explain this one. Colossians chapter 2, 16 and 17. Let's look at that. Colossians 2. Sometime this verse is not always used very well, but I think understanding it in this regard will help us make sure we apply it right. Colossians 2:16 and 17. Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of an holy day or of the new moon or of the Sabbath days, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body of Christ. Wait a minute. Wait. You're over there eating that meat and judge you. You're drinking that drink. Don't you know that that was offered to an idol and judge you? You know what you didn't do? You did not keep the holy day. You are not observing the Sabbath days. Gentiles, listen. You don't have to keep that holy day. And don't let people judge you by that. That was their traditions. It was part of their old law, and they made that old law traditional and trying to carry it into the new. Now, don't let anybody judge you on that. And so that's a way not to judge by our traditions. Now, here's one. Let's go back to Matthew 7. Matthew 7. And it says what you want to do. Don't want to judge someone when you're doing something worse. It's always easier to see the sins of others, isn't it? I mean, someone do something, you think that's bad, and then here you're doing it. It says here in Matthew 7, 3 through 5, and that's why and I think I had this backwards this morning when I was talking, but most of you understood what I meant when I was saying this. If you caught that I had that backwards, well, that is just very good. You were really listening and you caught it, but I got thinking, I think I said it backwards. But here it is. It says, why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, and considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Or how wilt thou say to thy brother, let me get the mote out of thine eye? Behold, there's a beam in thy own eye. Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam out of thine own eye. Then thou shalt see clearly cast the mote out of thy brother's eye. You see, it's easier for us to see the motes in our brethren. And well, yeah, but I've got a reason I'm this way. Or there's something, or it's not that big a deal. What my problem is, and we'll excuse ourselves and be quick to judge others for some small fault. And that too was something that Jesus needed to teach, because it was going to be a problem in the church. Look at Romans chapter 2. In Romans chapter 1, Paul talked about how wicked the Gentiles had become. Now, I just want you to imagine you're a Jew reading Romans chapter 1. You're saying, yeah, boy, yeah, he's giving it to them, those Gentiles. They have really turned into a wicked bunch. And then you come to Romans chapter 2, and he says, therefore thou art inexcusable, O man, whoever thou art that judgest. For wherein thou judgest another, thou condemnest thyself. But thou that judgest doest the same things. You see, Paul first condemns unrighteousness. And then he condemns self-righteousness. They were looking at the motes in their brother's eyes and ignoring their own beams in their eye. Now here's one that we got to watch. We hear a lot about, and the Bible teaches on this, and that is judging ethnicities. Judging by ethnic judgment, ethnicity. A lot of times we'll say it this way. The word is racism, okay? What are we talking about when we're talking about racism? Well, usually we're talking about something about judging someone because of their ethnicity, okay? Not just their color, but their whole culture and where they're from and their whole background. And they're just different than us, and judging people for that reason. Well, there's a problem with that in the Bible. You remember John 4 and verse 9. Jesus is going through Samaria. Now you got to remember now, these Jews and Samaritans now, they just could not take each other. These Samaritans were part Jew and part Gentile. They were a mixed race. And the true blue Jews down there, they just despise Samaritans. Really, the Samaritans were too much like them, and they just couldn't take that. Okay, but they were part Jews. Well, Jesus comes in John chapter 4 and verse 9 and asks for a drink of water. Let's see, I'm in Luke. Let me get over here to John chapter 4 and verse 9. And look at what the woman said. It says, "Then said the woman of Samaria unto him, How is it that thou being a Jew ask a drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? For the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans." Wait a minute. You're a Jew asking me, a Samaritan, for water? Why are you doing that? And so she's judging based on the fact that she knew he was a Jew. And the disciples have trouble with this as well. Go down to verse 27. It says here, "And upon this came his disciples and marveled that he talked to the woman. Yet no man asked, What seekest thou, or why talkest thou with her?" They come back, Jesus is talking to a Samaritan woman. Well, we Jews and Samaritan, we're not going to talk to each other, see? Judging that by the ethnicity. We find this again. We find my place. And look at Luke chapter 9, 51. Luke 9, 51. Here's what we have. You all are following this so well tonight. I'm just so proud of you. It says, "It came to pass when the time was come that he should be received up, he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem." This is Jesus. He's going to pass through Samaria. "And sent messengers before his face, and they went and entered into a village of the Samaritans to make ready for him. And they did not receive him, because his face was as though it would go to Jerusalem." They didn't want some Jew going to Jerusalem stopping here in our town. The Samaritans despised the Jews and judged them ethnically. Well, now the disciples had a problem too. They didn't have any patience with this. When the disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, "Lord, wilt thou command that fire come down from heaven and consume them?" Just burn them up. They didn't like the Samaritans either. And so there was a real problem with the ethnicity here. This is telling, I think. Look at Luke 10 and verse 37. That's it. Jesus said to love thy neighbor as thyself. And here's a lawyer, okay? You know the lawyers, what they do, they get real technical. Okay, who is my neighbor? Well, you could get into a big technical legal discussion about the proper definition of a neighbor. Jesus didn't do that. Jesus said, let me tell you a story. And he told about the man that was waylaid by the thieves, and a certain Levite came by and he didn't help him. And a priest came by and he didn't help him. But a certain Samaritan. A Samaritan. Now remember, he's talking to a bunch of Jews and they don't like Samaritans. But a Samaritan came by and showed mercy on him. And then Jesus asked, who then was neighbor to that man? And you know what the lawyer said? He did not say the Samaritan. Here's what he said. He said in verse 37, he that showed mercy on him. Could he not bring himself to say Samaritan? I just wonder, I just can't take this Samaritan. I'm not going to say Samaritan. I'll just say he that showed mercy on him. And these lawyers, they get real fine in their language. Well, Jesus talked about, okay, you know who your neighbor is. You know what to do. You know what? He didn't get into an argument with him about it. He didn't like Samaritan. And when they were really mad at Jesus and started calling him names, look at John chapter 8 and verse 48. They were going to get really ugly. What's the worst thing we can call him? So they say in John 8:48, then answered the Jews and said to him, say we not well that thou art a Samaritan and hast a devil? That's about as bad an insult as a Jew could throw at someone, is to say, you're a Samaritan. Well, you can't judge people by their ethnicity. Now think of the Jews and Gentiles. You remember Paul when he was in Ephesus and there was an uproar and they were all in the theater and they weren't sure why they were there and it looked like trouble, and they set a man out to explain it to them, and he started to talk to them about it, and someone hollers out, "He's a Jew!" And they yelled for the space of 3 hours, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." He was a Jew. That gave them the excuse to just yell that out. Now, the Jews were no better. You remember when Paul was accused of bringing a Gentile into the temple, and the guards took him, he's on his way up the steps, he beckons with his hand, and they all got quiet, and he spoke to them in the Hebrew tongue, and they were all listening. And they listened in that quiet until he said, "God had sent me to go preach to the Gentiles." That one word set them off. They ripped their clothes and threw dust in the air and said, "It's not fit that that man should live." Gentiles. Now that's the kind of hatred that existed between Jew and Gentile. There are two passages here that are sometimes difficult to understand that I want to get into and explain this in this idea of judging ethnically. Let's look at this one in Matthew 15, 21 through 28. And this one can kind of bother you here. What is going on? It seems out of character of Jesus. Matthew 15 and in verse 21, "Then Jesus went thence and departed into the coast of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a woman of Canaan came out of the same coast and cried unto him, saying, Have mercy on me, O Lord, thou son of David. My daughter is grievously vexed with the devil." Now, how does Jesus usually respond to something like that? He is so kind and gracious and accommodating and helpful. But what did he do? He says, he answered her not a word. That seems out of character, doesn't it? How could he ignore something like that? Well, his disciples came and besought, saying, "Send her away, for she crieth after us." And Jesus answered and said, now here's what he said, "I'm not sent but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." He acts like he's not going to help her. And then came she and worshiped him, saying, "Lord, help me." How could we know Jesus' heart? How do you turn away from that? Well, here's what Jesus said. He answered and said, "It's not meet to take the children's bread and cast it to the dogs." Now, I wonder what those disciples must have been thinking. Now, I don't know if I have this right or not, but here's the way I explain that passage. I think Jesus is showing his disciples who they are. He knows how they would treat her. They wouldn't help her. She's a woman of Canaan. I'm not going to listen to her. Send her away. That's what they said. And then Jesus said, we're not going to take things for the children and give it to dogs. And I wonder if the disciples may have even thought, whoa, that's a little rough, isn't it? That's out of character of Jesus. And so we read this then. And she said, "True, Lord, yet the dogs eat the crumbs which fall from the master's table." And Jesus answered and said unto her, everything changes here. He said, "O woman, great is thy faith. Be it unto thee as thou wilt." And thy daughter was made whole from that hour. What was Jesus doing? I think he's teaching his disciples. You can't treat people like you're doing. Let me show you what that looks like. And then he does this, and they're sitting there, and this wasn't like the Jesus they expected. And he showed them by behaving like them how bad that was to treat people like that. He knew what was going to happen. He knew this woman had the faith, and here was a teaching opportunity. And that's the way I can best explain that. There's another one here. And this one, I touched on this the other day, and it won't hurt to repeat it. Because again, it seems out of character of Paul. When you come to the book of Titus, And in Titus chapter 1, let me get back down to the right verse. Begin in verse 10. There are many unruly and vain talkers and deceivers, especially they of the circumcision, whose mouths must be stopped, who subvert whole houses, teaching things they ought not for filthy lucre's sake. One of themselves, even a prophet of their own, said the Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, slow bellies. This witness is true. Wherefore rebuke them sharply, that they may be sound in the faith. Is he saying it's true that the Cretans are always liars? Is that what Paul is saying? He just said you need to stop the mouths of unruly and vain talkers. And one of their own prophets, it's one of these unruly and vain talkers, are running around saying the Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, slow bellies. You need to stop that mouth. What is true here? Is it true that the Cretans are always liars? Let me suggest this. What is true is that one of their own prophets are going around saying this. And you elders, you need to stop their mouth. This is not the way to reach the Gentiles on the island of Crete by going around saying they're evil beasts, slow bellies, and liars. Stop that unruly and vain talk. And so I don't think Paul's saying, agreeing the Cretans are always liars. I think there's another way to read that certainly seems more consistent with what the Scriptures say. Well, I'm running out of time, so let me just quickly go to this. You don't want to jump to conclusions. You don't want to judge by association. Remember how Jesus over there eating with sinners as though he was one. Well, don't jump to conclusions. Don't say he's not of us. Remember there was a man casting out demons that wasn't one of us? And they said, Lord, forbid him. He said, no, let him alone. He that's not with us, he that's not against us is with us. He's not with us, is against us. He said, just because he wasn't one of the inner 12 doesn't mean he was doing something wrong. Now, that doesn't mean that this man was out here teaching denominational doctrine. Some people have that all messed up. What he was doing was right. He just hadn't been part of that company that was around Jesus doing this. And so sometimes because they're not one of us. Wait a minute. They're not from Tennessee, you know. They came out of Massachusetts or something, and so we're going to judge them. Well, that's not what you do. That's not how you judge. All right. In matters of conscience, the eating of meat and the things sacrificed to idols, 2 chapters, Romans 14, 1 Corinthians 8, and then unjust critical judgments. I touched on this the other day. Let no man despise thy youth. Of all things to judge someone on. They're young, and therefore judge them. No, and it's like I said in there, that youth is incidental. If you're old, don't let any man despise you because you're old. If you're big, don't let anybody despise you because you're big. If you're little, don't let them despise you because you're little. Though, if you want to despise a preacher, you can find a reason to do it because a preacher's a human being just like you and probably has as many faults as you have, and you can look for them and find them and despise them for that. But if you're going to preach, you can't let that stop you from preaching. That's what he means, let no man despise thy youth. So there's just unjust critical judgments. Now, judge not does not mean don't preach the truth. We're going to preach the truth, and we're out preaching the truth to a sinful world, and we're going to do that. And it does mean don't judge by your own standards, but when you're helping someone overcome a sin, how are you to go to that person? Judgmentally? If a man be overtaken in a fault, he that is a spiritual unto you, let him restore that brother in a spirit of what? Judgment. No. Galatians 1 verse 6, in the spirit of meekness. And then the humility here, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. And we're subject to these temptations. How would you want that brother to come to you? In a spirit of meekness, not in a spirit of judgment. Jude 20. Some, having compassion, make a difference. That's how you come to someone. Now, some you got to pull them out of the fire, but some, having compassion, make a difference. And I'll close with Luke 6:36. We looked at Luke chapter 6 and verse 37, where it says, "Judge not, and you shall not be judged." That's verse 37. Luke 6:36 said, just before that, says this, "Be ye therefore merciful, as your Father also is merciful." So yeah, there's a kind of judgment we need to make, and we can abuse that judge not, but let's don't hide behind that and get the idea that it doesn't have any application. Who of us who are not sitting here thinking, I need to work on that myself? I hope most of us did, and judging ourselves, think we've got to be careful about how we judge one another. When we're talking about judgment, the ultimate judge is God, and there's a judgment at the last day, and the books will be open, and the book of life. I'm going to be judged out of those things written in their books. And so we're going to let the Lord do that judgment. What we need to do is we need to be ready for that judgment. None of us will be able to stand that test on our own. We're going to have to take the blood of Christ. And he said, "My Father, you're right. And you judged them correctly. I shed my blood so that you could be gracious." That's how we want to come to you. Let's be baptized into his death, into the benefits of his death. And if you need to respond to the invitation, come forward while we stand and sing.